Welcome to the MovieLabs 2030 Vision series. Today I'm talking to Christy Anzelmo from Foundry. She is the Chief Product Officer. Welcome to the Fireside Chat.
Thank you, Rich. It's great to be with you today.
I was curious, you were talking a little bit about your background. How did you go from fashion design, is that right, all the way to where you are today?
Yeah, definitely not a straightforward path, right? Yeah, definitely been on a journey. So, like you just said, right? So I started my career in fashion and costume design, ended up in product management. I worked in a few different industries, and then ended up, at Foundry, in this role where you're looking after product strategy for the whole business. Yeah, it's definitely been a journey. But I think for me, the thing that I've always been interested in is, working with creatives, working with creative teams and solving problems that help businesses be successful. And of course, it's different in fashion where you're also thinking about where you're physically going to make things, how you're going to get out on a boat and get it to a customer. But a lot of the product development process and, principles behind, operating a business is the same, right, for different kinds of product categories. And to be honest, I did come into VFX, later in my career now, I guess mid-career, you could say. But it's a fantastic industry. I really wish it's something that I would have known about much sooner, because I've always loved, digital art, technology behind digital art, and working with creative teams, like I just said. So it's really been a great place to end up.
Yeah, I think when we're working with creatives, and that's what we're always talking about, is what we do is all about enabling the creatives. Having a background where you've been a creative or you still are a creative, I think that's actually really helpful. So, we launched this 2030 vision a couple years ago, and I'm just wondering, what was your first impression when you first heard about it?
Yeah, so back in 2019, right, when the vision was launched, so I first heard about it in a conversation with Shadi at Disney, who's one of the contributors to the MovieLabs vision. I was head of product for Nuke at the time, so not in my current role, but in the previous role I had at Foundry. And Shadi really recommended to take a look at it, especially because of the interest in areas around interop and data portability, and those were all things that we were very interested in. With Nuke in particular, Nuke being a compositing application, it really needs to receive as much data as possible. And we're always looking at ways to improve interop and get more data into comp.
How would you say the 2030 vision has influenced your product roadmaps there over at Foundry?
Yeah, so I think, of course, beyond Nuke, right, the management team at Foundry picked up the 2030 vision right away as well. We, at Foundry really value listening to our customers and really wanted to, see what the other visionaries in the industry were thinking, right? Especially those at the big studios and how they're visualizing the future. And from that, we saw a lot of alignment with the way we also saw the industry moving, towards, yes, like we said, greater interop, more, embracing open standards, as well as growing technologies like machine learning and AI for automation of non-creative tasks and things like that. So there was a lot of alignment there. The biggest kind of piece of work that we've done in our roadmap so far towards the 2030 vision is a project called OpenAssetIO, which is an open source project that was started by Foundry, but it's now part of the Academy Software Foundation. And it's all about how we can enable more efficient content creation, pipeline creation that can reach across, on-prem, hybrid, and in the cloud infrastructure.
So the first few principles of the 2030 vision are about really establishing a cloud foundation. And the way we define cloud is any combination of public, private, on-prem, that whole hybrid. And so the first principle is about moving all assets straight to the cloud, and they don't have to move. And the next principle 2, is about applications coming to the media. We think these are critical for achieving the 2030 vision. And it's really a different way of doing things than the way we do things today. We know these things are challenging. So how are you thinking about enabling and sort of living these principles at Foundry with respect to your products?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, Foundry is mainly known for desktop software. Definitely, that's mainly what we do. Still, it's very true. But we have been experimenting in the cloud for quite some time. So back in 2018, you might remember we had a product, an offering called Ethera, which was a web-hosted service, essentially a pipeline in the cloud. And that was ultimately unsuccessful. We wound it down at the end of 2019. But we did learn a lot about what it takes to enable the industry's transition from, current kind of on-prem ways of working through hybrid and then into the cloud. And one of the key takeaways is, like you said, like it's a transition, right? It's not for most studios, it's not this massive one-time transformation. And that idea of enabling a transition that will take some time and a lot of learnings along the way is one of the principles behind OpenAssetIO. So essentially what OpenAssetIO is a universal asset resolution interface, or more simply, right, it's a way for tools and DCC applications to speak to asset management systems. So without OpenAssetIO today, right, you need to write specific integrations generally for almost every application and every workflow that you want to build in your pipeline, which takes a lot of effort. It's generally not very scalable, and there's a big maintenance overhead. And of course, you then need to adjust all those integrations if you're going to make an infrastructure change, like moving from, on-prem to the cloud, for example. Because OpenAssetIO allows the pipeline to speak a single asset-centric language, agnostic of, the specific structure of your data, whether your data is located on-prem, fully in the cloud, or some combination in between, it makes it a lot easier to build pipelines that can move from on-prem to the cloud with minimal effort and a much lower maintenance overhead than the current way of working. It also, because it's asset-centric in the way that it works versus file-based, it creates a lot of new avenues for interoperability and kind of smoother, more efficient integrations. If you're moving data, from editorial into comp, for example, it's much easier to automate than it is kind of with traditional, APIs that exist today.
So that breaks the dependency then on the application, on the file systems, which I think we've identified as one of the gaps that's actually holding us back from moving forward in this direction. So that's great to hear. You talked a little bit about interop. That's actually the next topic. So thanks for teeing that up. Interoperability is a big priority for us here at MovieLabs, and it's an integral part of the 2030 vision. This includes interoperability for both data exchange and automation. How do you guys look at interoperability at Foundry, in particular with your tools?
Yeah, so interoperability, and especially interop via data, is something that's really key for us. And it has been forever, really, at the history of Foundry. We see ourselves as, adding value through the tools and the workflows that we build, rather than the formats that we create, or creating, walled gardens based on data and formats. And, we've long been supporters of open source standards. Nuke was one of the driving adopters of OpenEXR, for example. And it's really important to us, and we're seeing more and more of it. Of course, OpenEXR is very much established, so is OpenColor.io these days. USD is becoming significantly more important really to all of our tools at Foundry and industry workflows. And this is an area that is really important to us and is only something we're continuing to invest in.
So we're aligned here. We're talking about how we can enable this future. Can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective and maybe from your customer's perspective, what some of these future workflows will look like? What are the benefits of enabling all this interoperability and cloud-based workflows?
Yeah, so there's probably two different ways I can can answer this question. So one is an example about, thinking about OpenAssetIO and asset centricity versus files and what that means. So like, for example, today, right? So Nuke, right, is entirely file-based, has no understanding of assets. And so every studio has to write their own nodes, their own tools for reading in files, their own ways of managing versioning, right? Because versioning in Nuke is all based on the file name, which is, can just be honest, it's a faff because, you want to name files, you want to name them, you want to call assets what they are. It almost is, it's a bit of a, that you need to name things in a certain way in order for Nuke to understand it is a hurdle that you have to jump over. With OpenAssetIO, that goes away, right? You're able to not spend time building those integrations, to kind of working around the way that Nuke expects files to be named in order to access your data. It makes it a lot more straightforward to find, reference, ultimately use data that you need to in your project without being so much in the weeds about file names. And I mean, we think about Nuke too in compositing, like at Nuke scale compositing, like the average script has something like 200 reads in. So 200 different assets, different pieces of data that are coming into that script to eventually be merged together. So it's not small scale that we're talking about here. It's quite fundamental in the change of working.
So you'd still be able to know where everything, be able to find everything and get access to everything. You just wouldn't need to necessarily be in the weeds and know exactly how everything's named and organized. It's just there for you. So that actually seems quite nice. Although I think maybe it'd take a little bit for people to get used to and to let go of that. But in the end, I think, I certainly don't think about where my files are when I'm accessing them in the cloud. I just have access to them. And so I think that's actually a freeing step. So you recognize this was a need for your applications as we move to this future, and then realize, hey, everyone's going to run into this same issue. That's probably, I guess, why you wanted to open source this and look at, rather than having, and you mentioned this, everyone would have to do this a different way, in a bespoke way. This is sort of gets to what we're trying to do as well, is to create common solutions so that we can all get there faster in an easier way, rather than all having to repeat the same work in discrete, bespoke ways. So I think that's really great. What are some of the other benefits? Like, I think as we get to the, to the 2030 vision.
Yeah. Well, definitely. I mean, what you said about, the taking the things that were all bespoke and trying to make them more standardized, right, more universal, right, and how we do them is like, that definitely resonates with us as well. And of course, like, today, like large, and this I think too is a good point to think about around the 2030 vision. It's really created by large studios, right? It's a lot of large studio stakeholders, right, that contributed to the vision. But we see, like, for that example I talked about files versus assets, like today, a lot of large studios have written their own asset system and implemented it into Nuke and work around the way Nuke works today. But that's not something that's accessible to mid-sized, smaller studios that don't have big technical teams building those complex integrations. But by using something like OpenAssetIO and to replace that file system, it is available to everyone, right? It's something that the smaller studios can benefit from, that brings them more to that level of sophistication that only a large studio will have today. So that's definitely a win, for sure. I mean, I think there's also, we could talk about assets and data interop for hours, and certainly I'm sure, but we definitely have. So there's much more we could do there.
And we do, yes.
But the cloud is more than that, right? I think the cloud has a lot of potential for improving performance, right? And it's something that we've learned, again, coming out of Ethera and that project and using the infrastructure behind Ethera, which was some really great kind of learnings around data orchestration in the cloud and how you can leverage the cloud to scale compute, to learn how, when you do have more resources available, you can accelerate your work, right, and get faster, more iterative responses, like for the artist. And like, for example, Katana has, which is Foundry's lift and lighting package. It has a tool that's called Foresight Plus. And what it does is allows you to use any like resources available, whether that's a local render farm or in the cloud, to vastly accelerate, to share the workload to accelerate your render preview process. So when you're an artist lighting in Katana, again, it's a massive scale generally that people are working with. You can use, spread out the compute to get a faster, more interactive response back to the artist. And it does work on a local render farm, but really it starts to shine when you get to the scale of the cloud and just having a vastly more compute available to feed, from Katana to get that quick interaction. So there's, just a couple of examples, right, of the way the cloud and moving towards more cloud-based workflows can benefit artists and creativity.
Yeah, that's great. So it seems that Ethereum might have been a little bit ahead of its time. Would you say that, one of the things you're doing is now that everything's sort of catching up, obviously with the pandemic, I think it accelerated a lot of companies' views on moving to the cloud, initially for remote access to get work done, but now also to leverage the cloud for what it does best and to really drive that efficiency that you mentioned. You look at now sort of reintroducing some of the concepts that you implemented in Ethereum into your products now to move us back into that cloud-based future.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there are definitely learnings from Ethereum that, I think one of the biggest ones, right, is about that, how do we make sure that we stay close to our customers and help support them as they make the transition, the change to cloud? Because one of the shortcomings of Ethereum was that it was entirely cloud specific. Like, you needed to be working in that platform only. Everything was cloud. There was not the level of kind of customization, support for plugins, et cetera, that studios really needed to have. And, that's an approach, again, we've taken with OpenAssetIO, thinking about how do we make customization and pipeline ability easier to transport to the cloud, and more scalable in the end. And we also, of course, take those learnings around like data orchestration, like I mentioned, and performance, and applying them in features like Foresight and Katana, but also working with partners, right? Like, the cloud providers who are really the ones plowing ahead, right, on making these workflows real. Because, the learnings we had for Ethereum, we don't want them to just be for us. We want them to end up in a place where the industry can benefit from them. So we're always happy to partner, collaborate, test and learn with everyone, right, that's working on making workflows faster, more efficient, and scalable.
So we touched on a lot of technology-based solutions to try and drive towards this 2030 vision. But there's obviously this human element. I think you mentioned that a little bit before. We talk about it as change management. And as we are rolling out new technologies and new ways to do things, and you guys do this all the time as you roll out new software updates and features, how do you bring everyone along? How is it that we can get the people who need to do all this stuff to understand the benefits and want to make the changes? What do you guys do?
Yeah, I think, it's a great point, right? How do we make the change happen, right, and enable this like transition, right, in workflows? And I think a big part of it, right, is demonstrating the value, right, the value of making the change. Having compelling workflows that encourage everyone to get over the hurdles that are there, right, to move to a new way of working. And I think we're starting to see more of that now. Like, certainly, machine learning is one technology that can definitely leverage the cloud, right, in a different way that can move people forward. Also seeing some great workflows around review. Again, things that we've come across like through MovieLabs, like the CDI protocol from AWS as an example for color accurate review in the cloud. Those things, I think, start to show that there is real value in doing VFX and in animation work in the cloud, and that gives that motivation. of course, it then needs to be supported with education for studios and developers and studios, and really building the skills needed to take advantage of those things and make that change real. But I do think, my view, it's all about that workflow value and showing there's a real reason to change that makes it worthwhile.
Yeah. So you touched on it with OpenAssetIO, and open source and open standards, and it's really great to hear. Can you talk a little bit more about the role that open source plays in your strategy as Chief Product Officer? Like, how do you determine what should be open source, what's part of the product that's not open source? Can you talk a little bit about the strategy that's behind that?
Yeah, that's also a great question, and it's something that I have other product leaders and other companies ask me about a lot, right? How do you make a case for open source and supporting open source? And, I think it goes back to what we were just saying, right? The way we see ourselves competing is based on workflows and the tools that we build and how that enables artists, rather than on, standards for data and interoperability. And we don't have to own that in order to succeed in our mission. And it's actually better, right? Our customers will see more value if things like OpenAssetIO are implemented broadly, across the pipeline in as many applications as possible. And the open source community is a great way to do that, to help encourage that adoption, but also to make sure that we're not developing in a vacuum. We're developing with other contributors who also care about these standards.
Yeah, I think we're hearing more and more companies like you talk about that. And it's so great to hear, because I think where we're headed, there's really no alternative. And so embracing all these open projects, I think is super important, especially to achieve interoperability. One of the things that we published recently is the Ontology for media creation. And that's really a common ontology that we think underpins and enables a number of these interoperability efforts. You've heard of this. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about it. How are you guys looking at using, or what do you think about the ontology that we published?
Yeah, so the ontology is a fantastic effort to, not only create a shared language across, the real breadth of, production, post, all of the different viewpoints that we bring into having these discussions about workflow and interop, but also to describe how things work together and the relativity between them. And of course, with OpenAssetIO, we care a lot about making sure that, the language that we're using is compatible with the ontology. But it's also something that's used internally at Foundry as part of our product development process. And I was speaking to one of our product designers just today about how much he uses the ontology and how important it's become to him as a way to describe workflows and to really utilize having that shared language, especially when we're coming up with something new that might not be a way of working that exists today. So it's a really fantastic effort.
That's great. Thanks. Yeah, that's really where we spend our time, is in these sort of non-competitive areas where we're hoping that companies like you don't feel like they need to own a certain area, and we can all embrace some of these common features or common elements. So as we go forward, I think we're constantly looking at how we're making progress against the 2030 vision. We have a showcase program that we launched last year where we highlight case studies that are demonstrating certain principles being put into practice. And it's really great that we're making that progress. But we also, at the same time, are always looking at the gaps between where we are today and how we need to get to the 2030 vision. And we have blogs about that as well for the industry to look at and hopefully respond to. When you look at the 2030 vision and that path to getting there, what do you think the biggest gaps are that you're dealing with and trying to close?
So one of the key gaps that we see and that we're thinking about a lot at Foundry is about data sharing, data sharing across the pipeline. So whether that's, production and bringing data from onset into post, multiple post-production studios that need to collaborate with each other that may not be sharing data, or even with one studio, departments that don't want to share data with each other. And, there is part of the MovieLabs vision where, the idea is that, the data doesn't move unless it's for performance reasons. But today, right, we do a lot of, building walls between data, needing to make copies of data to move it between teams, which is really inefficient, and it really holds back the ability to build, these great interop-based workflows and the kind of efficiency that we really want to achieve as a wider industry.
Yeah, that's for sure. Do you think that's partly a technology issue and also partly more of a change management issue with people sort of feeling comfortable about how to make their data available in this new model?
Yeah, I think it's both things, really, right? There are some technical challenges which the industry is working on solving, and the open source community is a great part of that. There's definitely efforts happening around like camera lens metadata, for example, on how to package that and get it meaningfully from production into post. Some great work happening with standards like OpenAssetIO around how metadata is described and stored and again moved across. So that is happening, right? And there are some challenges there which are being solved. But I think the bigger one is more about the attitude towards it, right? And various studios, vendors, whatever level you want to slice it at, seeing that data is being competitive versus being something that I think the thing studios should compete on, right, is the creative work they produce more so than the underlying data. Of course, when you're sharing data, it does come down to having, that consistent, well-managed, security, user management, identity management, all of those things, right, which is, again, part of the MovieLabs vision.
Yeah, thanks for teeing that up. That's actually one of the things I want to talk about next. Like I was talking about before, we're very focused on the things that we think can be common for the industry where we're not needing to compete. We talked about the ontology. Another area is security. And, when we published the 2030 vision, we also followed that with a paper on the need for a new approach to security, need to move away from perimeter-based security. And as we move to more cloud-based workflows, move to more of a zero trust based security approach. And we published our common security architecture for production, what we call CSAP. And so I know we've talked about this in the past a little bit, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on why that approach would actually be beneficial, why you think it would be beneficial, especially sitting from your perspective at Foundry.
Yeah, so in Foundry's approach so far to security, right, is always to be quite agnostic and flexible, right? Like we allow our customers to implement whatever kind of user management, user identity management, et cetera, systems they want on top of our software. And we make sure it plays quite well in lots of different environments. But having a standardized security protocol like CSAP is really helpful to us, because the more standardized these kind of systems become, the more we can, test against them, build against them, make sure they work really well in our tools, which is harder to do when, it's a really fragmented set of approaches that are out there.
Great. That's great to hear. So we're all on board with a secure, interoperable, cloud-based future, which is awesome, and really at the heart of the 2030 vision. And appreciate you guys stepping up as a leader in the industry to help drive this forward together with us. One of the things as we get close to wrapping up here on our time, one of the things I wanted to ask you was, we have people viewing this from all different parts of the industry, and coming from your perspective, what do you think is probably the most important thing about the 2030 vision that people should understand or realize as they prepare to move forward in this journey?
I would say, so if there's one thing that would be great to see more of, is more of the industry embracing open standards, not building those walled gardens, really looking at the open source community, contributing to building those open source standards that we can then all benefit from, and being more open to data sharing. And, if we do that, we can all build better workflows, better tools, and really move the industry forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks again so much for your time and your insights. It's been great chatting with you, and really appreciate your leadership in the industry and helping us get to the 2030 vision. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rich. Thank you for including me and Foundry, right, in this effort. It's great to see what MovieLabs has accomplished so far and to be part of achieving that 2030 vision.
Thanks for watching the MovieLabs 2030 Vision series. For more information about the MovieLabs 2030 Vision, including additional white papers, videos, blogs, architectures, and specifications, please check out our website at movielabs.com, and be sure to subscribe and follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube. Thanks.